What's up, everybody? Ryan Thomas, live on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. You guys are probably tuning in on every major platform that the podcast is now on, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Twitter, all of them. You're tuning in, and I've really appreciated all the love and support that I've received from the viewers and the listeners over the last few days as we've had this huge launch of the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And as I've told you guys before, I've had a lot of awesome guests on the show. And one of the best parts about my podcast, I've had the opportunity to meet some other podcasters locally in the area, which brings me to my next guest on the show, Josh Wrest of Trainwreck Sports. How's it going, Josh?
I am doing great. I'm actually really excited to be on, man. I've known Thomas for a while here. I'd probably say about half a year now since I joined at Trainwrecks, and I've been trying to get on. And here we are.
Yeah, it's awesome to have you. You've been an avid supporter of the show, and I really appreciate all the support. And I was really amped up to have you on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm proud of you for getting up on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It's big moves.
Yeah, it took me a little while, but technology, there's a learning curve sometimes, but you gotta apply in terms of Apple and go through all that, and it was pretty cool. It took a little bit of time, but I'm happy to be on it. So people will be able to tune in and download it on Apple as well as Spotify. So, but Josh, let's get right to it. You are on the show today to discuss with me fantasy football. You are now one of the 14 guys that will be competing in the Thomas Take Sports Podcast Fantasy Football League. And this is the first time I've actually talked about this on the podcast. The podcast league last year was a 10-team league. I told everybody I wanted to make it more competitive. I want to make it fun. I want to make it very, very fun but competitive. Make it tough on me because I won it last year and it was a little easy for me. So, Josh, I'm expecting you to come out of the gate making things a little bit tough for me. And some of the questions that I ask you in this show, you might be giving some of your secrets away.
I know, I got to be careful with what I say, apparently. Actually, I really want to get into that real quick. I've never actually done a 14-man league, which I am really excited to do. So I'm going to be starting doing some fantasy stuff for Trainwreck, just getting content out with that. I myself, right now, not including the Thomas Takes one, but I'm in a 12-man, a 10-man, and an 8-man. So I pretty much had, the best of all the worlds, and one of them's PPR, one's half PPR, and one's standard. So I've done pretty much everything except 14 players. So I'm really excited for that. And I love that you're really going to have to find depth players and sleepers where those late rounds really matter.
Right, and that's where you find the money selections. You got to find those sleepers, and especially in a 14-team league. I have been in a 14-team league, and drafting is very difficult. Not so much because you don't know who to pick, but because you're literally seeing names that you normally would pick just completely fall off the board, names that you'd pick in a 10, 12-team, 8-team league. So that's going to be a very fun dynamic. I'll actually have the 2019 TTSP Fantasy Football League pick order probably released tonight. I did that, randomly. And amongst the people that are in the league last year, their picks are already where they are. So in this league, I'll be picking 14th due to the fact that I won it last year as a 10-team. And then you and all the new guys that will be in it will be kind of automatically, done by random. So that'll be pretty fun to see where you'll end up picking. It'll give you an opportunity to prepare for your pick. So there you go.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, on that, personally, I'm one of the guys. Here's some of my secrets. You can't really make it happen. But one of my things is I always would rather draft late, especially in those 12-man leagues. I love getting the 12 and 13 pick. I absolutely love it. I would much rather have that than that first overall pick. And not to mention, it does take a lot of pressure off you. You don't look like an idiot when you draft Le'Veon. Well, I didn't do this, but you take a Le'Veon Bell and it doesn't play a snap all year. That's got to look crappy.
Right, and you are hitting the nail right on the head with that because so many owners last year took Le'Veon Bell and they were just completely burned. And then there were owners like myself who knew well enough to draft James Conner, or knew well enough to pick up James Conner, actually, and ride the lightning with him, which was pretty fun last year. But, Josh, I really want to get your take on some sleepers and some potential busts. As far as the position that you feel like you got to go after round one, if you have a top 10 pick, who's a guy that you would say is a lock as the best of the best inside that top 10?
Well, I'll put it this way. Obviously, first round is going to depend where you're drafting, of course.
Right.
No matter what, it's really never changed in this. My philosophy is I always want that workhorse two-threat back, the receiving back, and obviously rushing back. I don't like taking a receiver in the first round, and I feel like you never have to, because usually what tends to happen is probably this year it's going to go, Kamara, McCaffrey, not in this order, but, Kamara, McCaffrey, Zeke, and Barkley. Those will probably be the first four off the board, I would imagine. Then people will probably start snagging a couple receivers. I remember last year, which I think was a steal, as I got Melvin Gordon late in the 10th, or late in the top 10, like around 8 or 9.
Oh, wow.
Because, it's just, I want that back because, and this is what I was saying, is sometimes, you run out of players. Like, in a PPR league, you have so many more options, I feel, in depth, where you can get a late, 6th or 7th round pick that's a productive receiver for your squad because of PPR. Even if they're not Antonio Brown, they can easily get you 10 points. But after those first couple running backs go, the next thing you're looking at is you're just taking bets on, Aaron Jones to do well or something along those lines. And I like to avoid that. So I would probably have to chalk it up as it's go running back, that two-threat back, and if I had to pick a top pick, I'm going with Ezekiel Elliott.
Yesterday I did a top 10 fantasy football running backs, and spoiler alert, I do have Ezekiel Elliott number 1, but there is some hesitation there because now there's this story out about Ezekiel Elliott that he's going to be holding out, and that might chip into some of his playing time. It might chip into some of his practice time. Who knows? With situations like that, with a holdout, you really never know. Do I think it's something that's really serious? No, I don't. But if I'm drafting August 25th, which is the day of the Thomas Tick Sports Podcast Fantasy League, and I have the first overall pick, and there's this situation where Ezekiel Elliott is holding out, I probably wouldn't take him first overall just due to the fear that you don't want to take a guy like a Le'Veon Bell situation last year first overall and get burned on that first overall pick.
Yeah, I actually am really happy you brought that up, because I was about to bring that up too. I really don't like that he's doing that, and I don't like that Melvin Gordon's doing that. And I agree, that's totally something to watch. If they get a deal done, obviously nothing to worry about. He's number 1, Melvin Gordon, top 5, easy. But I know if you're getting into that week and they still haven't figured something out, I totally agree. And if that was the case, I'd probably say something like a Barkley then, because, Barkley's a workhorse, and obviously he's not worrying about that right now.
Right.
But, yeah, I know, so it's definitely something to watch for, because the last thing you want to do is take Zeke and you're 6 weeks in and then get that wouldn't be a first overall. But I do think I'd take him first. I just feel like he's a real true workhorse. Like I've said that a couple times. He can plow through lines. He's got moves. He's got speed. And I also think Barkley's that. But I just think this Zeke would be a secure, safe bet, not including that contract talk.
I've seen a lot of draft boards and ranking boards from quote-unquote esteemed writers, the Matthew Berrys, the Andy Behrens of the world, all those guys. And I follow them just because, they're entertaining and they are interesting, and they're working for major, entities, Yahoo and ESPN, the two biggest, fantasy entities that there are. And I find it interesting. Right now, if I take a look at the top 60 running backs, as in-depth a ranking as you'll ever find, 60 at the running back position, Matthew Berry has Saquon Barkley ranked number 1, which, to me, that's a huge red flag. And I think Saquon Barkley is a great player. There's no doubt about it. I actually think at some point in his career, he'll probably be in Canton, Ohio as a Pro Football Hall of Famer. But there's nothing else on that team but him, where you could have a very similar year to what Todd Gurley had a couple years ago, where they stacked the 8 guys in the box, and Barkley will be just bottled up. Where would you rank Saquon Barkley? Would you rank him in the top 3 of your running backs, or would he kind of slide outside the top 3?
Yeah, actually, I'm really glad you brought that up, too. That's one of the main reasons he's not number 1 for me. Is he like an absolute beast? The guy's insane. I mean, he's going to be great for every year. That's not the argument. The argument is you're right. Is they don't. I mean, I know they got Sterling Shepard, but the problem is either line's not that great. Like you said, they could easily stack the box. The team's not going to do well. I'm sorry, they're not going to do well. I don't think that's much of a surprise. I don't think they're going to do well at all. And that could definitely decline him a bit. Not like he's going to look bad or anything, but if I had to rank him, if you're telling me Melvin Gordon and Zeke are all good, they're signed, etc., and you got Barkley there, I would probably put him either 3rd or 4th, because personally I like Zeke number 1, like I said. I'm really high on Melvin Gordon because of that receiving ability. I might even put him at 2, and then I'd probably put McCaffrey and Barkley there. You know, I guess you can interchange them. So I would say it's definitely something to think about. I don't think he'd be number 1 strictly because of that team, if that answers the question.
Right. Yeah, I definitely think that does, and I think if you're looking at a ranking and you see that one guy is ranked number 1, but you don't think that guy is number 1, we obviously agree that Ezekiel Elliott is number 1. If Barkley's not number 1, I would say that to me, the running back that is not getting the credit that he deserves, it's not Melvin Gordon, it's not Alvin Kamara, but Christian McCaffrey. Now, I've owned Christian McCaffrey the last 3 years that he's been in the league, I think, 2-3 years, and he is a phenomenal asset for any fantasy team, but especially a PPR. If I'm in a PPR fantasy football league and I have the first overall pick, dare I say it, he might be my first overall pick in a big PPR fantasy league. What do you say to that?
You know what? The main reason I kind of scrutinized him a little bit, and it wasn't really him, it was the team. You know, they have been pretty mediocre for the last couple of seasons. Now, with that being said, and this will actually kind of put me into something else, I think the Panthers are actually probably going to do well this year. I don't think they have that bad of a team. I know they improved that offensive line when they got Greg Little, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
I know they got that center. They have a bumped up line. Not that he did fantastic last year, too, but I feel like they're going to have an improved offense. I do feel Cam Newton's going to take another step up, and that's actually one of my sleepers. Now, I know he is one of the top QBs generally, but I feel like he's been drafted on the low end of it strictly because they haven't been, you know, I mean, they're 15-1 that one year. They clearly haven't been that.
Right.
But I do feel he's going to take a huge step this year, and I actually do not like Cam Newton. I just feel like the Panthers are going to be a pretty good team. So I would not scrutinize. I think I'd put it this way. That Barkley, Elliott, McCaffrey, and Gordon, personally, I think are my top 4 running backs. And Kamara, I guess I'd put at 5th. But I'm not putting him in this list. Those 4 running backs, I think there's an argument for every single one at first. I know there's an argument for Zeke. Clearly there is for Barkley. The dude's an absolute stud. McCaffrey's that 2-threat back, which I praise about. You know, like that's what you want. PPR, just nonstop points. And then that's Melvin Gordon and that's Kamara. So, you know, I wouldn't judge you for it at all. Wouldn't judge you at all.
Wouldn't judge at all. I like that. And as far as you know, some guys that are kind of the outliers, there's a guy that I ranked 10th as the top in my top 10. I ranked him 10th, and that is a rookie running back by the name of Josh Jacobs, who was drafted by the Oakland Raiders with one of the 3 first-round draft choices that they had in this year's draft. I really like Josh Jacobs, and part of the reason why I'm so intrigued by him is that he didn't get overworked in college. He didn't have, you know, like a Devin Singletary workload. He split touches with Damian Harris, who was eventually drafted by the Patriots in the draft this year. What is your take on taking rookie running backs early in fantasy leagues?
2 things with that. Number number one, again, it is going to depend on the team a little bit, and that's not to judge on any of their skill level. I mean, I like Josh Jacobs. I don't know what my expectations are for the Raiders. Now, I will put it this way. If there is one position in fantasy football, or more or less in the NFL, that a running back's going to do well, or a position is going to do well, and it's running back. I mean,
right.
When you get drafted as a running back, you're pretty much in your prime. I mean,
right.
You have as speedy as you're going to get. You know, you're completely young. You got the energy. You're as good as you're going to get. So that's why these players get, like Barkley was phenomenal, because this is their prime. These are their prime years. They only get better. And I guess in terms of like playing, but like their body, and they pick it up quick, just like quarterbacks are shaky. I would never judge the running back for being a rookie. So I guess, like I'm saying, don't think of it that way. Like, don't think he's a rookie, I shouldn't be doing that. Just think of him as the running back for that team. What's the team's deal? You know, how's your line doing? You know, do they have help on the outside? What's the quarterback like? Is it, like, that's another instance why the Giants are a little shaky, because the quarterback's kind of up in the air. The receivers are up in the air a bit. That line is a mess.
Right.
But with the Raiders, I mean, they do have Carr, who has proven to be something. They've got clearly got Antonio Brown. I don't know much about the offensive line. You got some input on that? I don't know how they.
Yeah, as far as our offensive line goes, that's actually kind of one of the dynamics that I like about it, because they did steal away Trent Brown from the New England Patriots. He's their big, beefy left tackle, and they got Richie Incognito, who, you know,
that's right.
we know he's a little bit. You know, he's a little bit of an oddball. Every squirrel finds a nut eventually, but
yeah, he's up the deep end a little bit.
Yeah.
But the skill is undeniably there.
Right, and he's more so a great run blocker. So I'm a little bit bullish on that, because I don't know what his situation will be come the start of the season. He's going to be suspended for 2 games, and he always just seems to find a way to get into some sort of trouble, unfortunately, which I hope that's not the case again. But I think it's easier for me to honestly put Josh Jacobs in my top 10 than it is, and I'll just start off, as we segue here into some sort of busts. I can't convince myself to take Le'Veon Bell with a first-round pick in a fantasy draft. What do you say to that?
Absolutely not. I'm not going anywhere near him. I don't like it at all. I've seen him getting ranked 3, 4, 5. I don't think that at all. Could he be? Yeah. I just think it's way too risky. I had those 5 running backs above him. David Johnson, I think, should easily be above him. Gurley is actually something I want to ask you about, too. What are your opinions on him? Because that leg injury is kind of making me nervous. Do I think he's a better running back? If he wasn't having this injury, I would take Gurley over him.
Right, I would, too. Yeah, I agree.
Injury's a little scary.
Yeah, I agree.
Connors, I'd probably take over him, too, from last year.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm on the same page with you. I think that Gurley, I think he belongs in the top 10 of a ranking. If I'm thinking of names that belong in that top 10 ranking over Le'Veon Bell, I'd say guys like Joe Mixon of the Bengals, guys like...
I'm not too high on Mixon. That's another player. I am not high on Mixon. I never really liked him, and I don't like the team that's going on there. They just lost for the whole year. I think the team's going to be very bad. I really do. I don't think that's going to help him much. Of course, is he going to be a bad pick? Probably not. I guess it really depends where you get him, is my opinion. I guess if you ranked him at 10, I'd be okay with that. I wouldn't personally want to see him anywhere near the 7 or 6,
Mm-hmm.
If you got him at 10, I think I'd be okay with that. But, I have another question for you. I'll get my opinion after, but so what is your final opinion on Gurley this year? Because of that injury, which is a gamble at that point, it really is.
Right.
And Dalvin Cook. I mean...
Yeah, those are 2 situations that are very similar, because when both of them are healthy, they are the engine that keeps the car running, of that offense. When both of those guys are healthy and ready to rock, they're ready to rock for sure. But when they're not healthy, it's almost as if their injuries have this lasting effect. They could say in an injury report, they could say, well, Todd Gurley's back, he's active, he's healthy, ready for week 9. But then week 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, he's a shell of himself. And those are the weeks for fantasy football that you need. You need those weeks because those are the weeks that help you get into the playoffs, and those are the weeks that help you ultimately win a fantasy championship. So I'm a little bit leery of taking Todd Gurley, and I said it on Sunday's show yesterday's show that if Todd Gurley's sitting there in the second round, it would be very tough for me to take him. And I never thought I'd say that. In the second round, I don't know if I'd take him.
Already. You're in today with 12-man league to kind of get in the median. I think that's a pretty popular league. You got, say, second round, you got the 23rd pick. Who do you take? I guess it depends who's there, but say you have, say you got your Dalvin Cook there and Leonard Fournette, who also was kind of scary last year too. That's kind of an up in the air thing. Maybe you go a receiver then. It would really suck if you took a second round pick that turned out to nothing. So
right.
I guess I think if you had to draft in a safe way, I probably wouldn't touch him there either. I wouldn't judge you. I wouldn't take him in the first. I'm putting that out there.
Yeah.
That's not smart. If you got him in the second, I'll say it could be a steal of the draft,
right.
Because if he's completely healthy, I guess he would be a first round pick, yeah, but maybe he's not, and it's a no-go in my book.
I look at, if I'm in the second round and I'm looking at taking Todd Gurley, that means I want or need to take a running back. So if I want or need to take a running back, I'm going to look at who else is available. And if Todd Gurley is still... If Todd Gurley...
Say you got Fournette and Devontae Freeman still there, Nick Chubb.
I'd say Chubb. The guys that I'd be looking at, I'd say Chubb, Derrick Henry... Kerryon Johnson, and
I think Kerryon Johnson could be that's actually one of my sleepers. I think he's going to be a very good running back. I have high hopes for the Lions this year. Maybe not like Super Bowl, but I think they're going to be a team to reckon with.
They're definitely going to be better for sure.
Yeah. So I think that's going to improve him, and I liked what he did last year. I mean, he was the first one to get 100 rushing yards for that team. What, like 13?
Yeah, in a long time. It
was scary over there.
Well, we talked running backs a little bit, and you would say, your sleepers, guys like Kerryon Johnson, Nick Chubb, obviously we threw in there. Who's a guy that you think could end up being in the top 5 of the final rankings when the 2019 season is over? Who's a guy that you could see being that elite of the elite guy heading into 2020?
Now, running back or any position?
Any position. Yeah, it could be running back or wide receiver or quarterback or whoever. Who's like your most likely top 5 guy? What was that?
Okay, I like that. You know who I could see being one of those guys? Jordan Howard.
Okay.
I really don't know what happened with him in the Bears. I mean, he had a fantastic year. I think he was top 5 in yards, finishing. He was. Don't know if he actually finished, but he was like top 5 in yards. He's got a size to him. I know Tariq Cohen kind of shattered that a bit for him because of his speed, and I know he lost playing time, but he's on the Eagles, and I think he's going to do really well. I think I could easily see him. I think I could easily see him being a top 10, and if I seen him in the top 5, I'd be like, okay. He was there.
Right.
He was there at one point, so he's still young.
Yeah, I'm looking at my own kind of rankings that I've compiled, and Jordan Howard is somewhere in the mid-20s, but with the names that are around him, guys like Philip Lindsay, Sony Michel, Kenyon Drake, I like his team situation, as you've alluded to, being a main factor in how you draft and how you evaluate fantasy football players that you're going to potentially draft. I think he's got a real good situation. Now, if you have Jordan Howard and you draft him and Carson Wentz is healthy from week 1 to week 8 and Jordan Howard's doing good, but then what if Carson Wentz gets hurt again? Then that could put a big target on Jordan Howard's back. which is the only reason I'd be a little bit leery of taking him. It's not even about him; it's more about the team around him. But
I agree.
You can't.
That's what I'm saying, though. I think that's a prime time sleeper, though. If you can, I don't know where I would take him. Again, fantasy's kind of hard because it would depend what you're working with right now. If you already had two backs and maybe because I think he is going to fall. I think he's going to fall pretty far, personally, and I don't think he should. But I think he's going to. And I think you can get him late. I think it's a real smart pickup. I personally, I think I'd be okay with them being my running back 2. But, I mean, if you can get him as a running back 3, I think he could even become your number 1. You know?
Right,
I think if the cards align, which they could, I think he could be very, very good, which he is.
Yeah, I agree. I like that. I like that a lot. Now we'll move on to wide receivers. For my money, the number 1 wide receiver in fantasy football should be a guy that didn't even drop a pass last year with the Houston Texans, DeAndre Hopkins. To play devil's advocate, if you think that DeAndre is the number 1, like I do, or if you don't, let me know who you think could possibly be number 1 that isn't DeAndre Hopkins. Who's another guy that you really like outside of DeAndre?
So I put Hopkins number 1. But if I had to put someone else there, you know, as much as Julio's skill is absolutely insane, I mean, the guy's a beast. I think Matt Ryan's going to be the team's going to be a little declined. So I don't see him being that number 1 as much as he is absolutely the top receivers. I don't see him being at the number 1. There is I would say there's 2 people, which I really don't think would happen. But, you know, for the sake of it, to pick someone, I could see Devontae Adams being someone up there. Because I feel Aaron Rodgers and the Packers are going to have a really good year. I think he's going to have a really good year.
It's funny you say that because if I pull up, Matthew Berry's rankings, he has Devontae Adams number 1 and DeAndre Hopkins number 2, which...
No, that's interesting.
Yeah, that was eye-opening to me. He's got Devontae Adams number 1, DeAndre Hopkins number 2, Julio Jones number 3, and that's his top 3. Slotting in at 4, Odell Beckham Jr. 5th, Michael Thomas. Now, for me, I'll dive into my take on that just briefly. When a receiver goes from one team to the next, we had a real active offseason this year. We had Odell Beckham go from the Giants to the Browns, and we had Antonio Brown go from the Steelers to the Raiders. These last few years, those are arguably the 2 biggest fantasy wide receivers in the game. How high are you willing to go all in on Odell Beckham or on Antonio Brown? Or are you going to avoid taking a receiver that is on a new team? Does that scare you at all as a fantasy player?
Absolutely. So we'll touch base on Antonio Brown. Number 1, he is getting old.
Right.
He's getting up there. Now, I'm not saying he's going to be bad. He's going to be great still. I don't see a way he's the number 1 receiver. There's no way he finishes number 1. I quite frankly don't think he even finishes 2 or 3. I would stay clear of Antonio. With that being said, if I needed a 1 receiver and you're telling me Adams, Hopkins, Thomas are gone, Julio's gone, Beckham's gone, probably would take him then if I really need the receiver there. But I wouldn't be stretching at all for him. It would have to be just there's no one else left. I would take him then. And with Odell, I don't think it's the aspect of him moving to another team. I just think the Browns have a lot of playmakers now.
Right.
I mean, Jarvis Landry, who's could arguably be number 1 on the team, but he's not now. Callaway's there, which I think he's still going to be like that 3rd receiver, but he's going to be getting catches. He's great.
There's only one football.
There's only one football, yeah, absolutely. Now, of course, Odell's going to have good stats. I'm not going to say that, but I don't think he finishes in that top 1 or 2 or 3 either. I think he could. I don't think he does, though, just strictly because I think Baker is going to light it up, and he moves the ball. They got the Joku too. I mean, they got some players,
and those are just their receivers. They got Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. I mean,
yeah,
they're pretty loaded.
It's going to be insane. They're going to be moving that ball around, and again, that's actually why Odell exceeded so much in terms of being like a number one receiver at like to be picked at times because of being that number one guy of the Giants. And again, that's not bashing his skill. The guy's absolutely insane. But yeah, like you said, there's one football, so it's got to be moved around. And they got players, arguably maybe the best team with all the offensive weapons. To be quite honest with you.
Who is your biggest sleeper as a wide receiver?
This is a deep sleeper. Someone who I think could actually be, not say top five, but a nice sleeper receiver is that Dante. I don't know if that's what Pettis is on the 49ers.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, it's a deeper sleeper. Like, I'm not saying, take them fourth round and then roll it. Absolutely not saying that. But I think Jimmy G is going to come back. Now, I don't know how well he's going to do. I think he'll do all right, and I think they could be a decent team. But I think they're going to be a better team, and I think he might ball out a bit this year. I think
I like that.
PPR, I think he could be definitely something to reckon with. Again, don't be stretching for him, but if you're looking, you got receivers ready to go, and you see him there, maybe in. I'm trying to think maybe where he would go, but just in the later rounds, and you see him there, I wouldn't be afraid to snag him. I wouldn't be afraid.
I like that. I like the angle that you're looking at. You're looking at who is probably ranked in like the 30 to 40 range that could be like a 20 to 15 range. Depending
could easily be that with the PPR aspect. Yeah, where do they have? Oh, I see him right here. And the one I'm looking at, they ranked him at the 37 receiver.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like that. I like that outside the box, possibly. Him being better than that. In that a player that could be in that upper echelon, not elite of the elite, but better based on where you pick him. Moving on to
strictly value.
Just value, yeah. Tight ends. Tight ends is probably the worst position, I think, in fantasy football. And I'm going to tell you why.
Yep. Oh, I love it, go.
I'm going to tell you why. Because they're overdrafted based on the fact that the league is a passing league. And I shouldn't say overdrafted. They're reached for based on the fact that there's only 3 elite of the elite tight ends. Travis Kelce, Zach Ertz, and George Kittle. To any and all people that are listening to this podcast, if you don't end up with Travis Kelce, Zach Ertz, or George Kittle, you will see a drop-off. Is there a sleeper at the position? I'm going to ask Josh this right now. Outside of Travis Kelce, Zach Ertz, George Kittle, and Evan Ingram will say is in the top 5. Hunter Henry is in the top 5. So anyone outside of those 5 guys, who do you think could be a fantasy relevant tight end?
I will say 2 things. Number one, I couldn't agree with you more on the tight end thing. First off, I never go for those tight ends. I feel like you always have to reach for them, like you said. So I usually just don't even touch them. Not worth it to me. Quite frankly, I usually just play musical chairs at tight end.
Right.
I just kind of do it because that's kind of what tight ends are. Sometimes they might, it's the game lining up, or maybe they're going to be pounding the ball. Maybe they're used to blocking more, or maybe the blocking tight end gets used more. So it's always shaped even for those top,
right.
4 or 5. But if I did have to take a sleeper that I think you could probably get later. Which I guess it depends. He's ranked up there because of the low tight end drop-off, like you said. It's the biggest drop-off, and again, that's why I stay clear of it and just deal with it later. But I would say O.J. Howard is probably a good sleeper.
Right.
You could snag a little bit later. He's probably going to go higher now because of there's no one. But I think that's a sleeper because of he had he wasn't like a top tight end last year. He showed good spurts, though.
Right, and it's based on his athleticism and that offense and everything like that. I definitely agree with you that he might end up being a breakout player. A guy that I'd put in there is also, we touched on him, would be David Njoku, but another tight end I would put in there would be Trey Burton of the Bears. He had a real good stretch there in the fall months of the season, October, November. He was putting up numbers. I'd like to see where he's at next year. I'd like to, or this year, I should say. I'd like to see what chemistry he's been able to build with Mitch Trubisky. I really do.
I I like that a lot.
Yeah. So as far as your ideal strategy, without giving too much away, the quarterback position is the last position that we're going to go over. And everyone and their grandma knows that on every fantasy football ranking right now, Pat Mahomes is the number one guy. Now, I have a problem with that because I feel like most of these fantasy football writers rank players based on what they did last year, not what they're going to do this year. Who's a quarterback that you think will have that massive Pat Mahomes-esque season? We did say Cam Newton, but somebody that maybe people don't, not that they'd expect that, but Cam Newton has had those big years before. I'm looking for a guy that hasn't really had that massive year that could have a real big year in 2019.
I could touch base on a couple. So I know we just kind of said we're not going to include too much. I would definitely say Cam Newton's going to have an improved year. I know a lot of people are expecting it. I think Baker is going to have a phenomenal year. Mm-hmm. Now, he probably will go pretty high. I think a lot of people are going to be sold on him.
Right.
Other than that, though, my strategy, and this you'll see what I'm going is, my strategy generally, I don't take a high quarterback. And the reason for that is I feel like you can get production out of lower quarterbacks. So I guess the best comparison, and I guess this does depend a bit on some leagues have two quarterbacks in one. I guess for the sake of it, we'll say that's a one quarterback league. In say even 12 teams, I know people have backups, but not always. I mean, there's players to snag. I'm usually okay with, I'll usually snag like a Kirk Cousins or a Matt Stafford. Now, are they putting up like Pat Mahomes numbers? No. But it's consistent points, which I can get in the 8th or 9th round, and I'm stacking up my running backs, and where I look at this guy's team, and he has, some, I'm trying to think of a comparison, like Royce Freeman starting at his number one running back, and I'm like, oh, God. Yeah, I'm like, okay, like, you got Mahomes, but that's rough,
Right.
And so that's why I like to get, and another thing about, I'm a big consistency guy, which is why I like to get those 2-star running backs, because it's hard to find consistent running backs than you can get. Like,
and they get hurt. They get hurt.
Yeah. They get hurt.
Yep.
And I don't want to say play musical chairs with them, but I'm okay with, if I have to dump Matt Stafford this week and pick up Kirk Cousins, I'm great with that. Mm-hmm. When I want Patty Mahomes, of course, but instead of having, we'll say Melvin Gordon instead of Royce Freeman, I'll take Melvin Gordon and Kirk Cousins rather than Mahomes and Royce Freeman.
Right,
if that makes sense.
That's a good point. I definitely think that makes sense. You know who my fantasy quarterback sleeper is, Josh? Are you ready for this?
I'm ready. What is it?
My fantasy quarterback sleeper for the 2019 NFL season is none other than Josh Allen. What do you think of that?
It's hard to say as obviously Buffalo fans.
Right.
Now, the way to look at it, and obviously fantasy is strictly points, the dude can ball. And that doesn't mean just throwing. I think he showed great spurts with now lots of weapons around him. I mean, he can extend the ball. I mean, how far can this guy throw? I don't know. But, if you have the aspect of getting rushing yards, rushing touchdowns, and passing touchdowns, you'd have to imagine, and I'm not even trying to say they're going to go, 13 and whatever. He could even win six games next year and maybe finish the top 10 quarterback. You know what I mean? Because of the stuff he's going to be doing from running and being able with all these abilities now, especially with John Brown here, Cole Beasley here, Jay Jones he's taken steps the last 2 years. Third year, he's probably going to be even better. Improved O-line, and he looked, I think the last, week 11 to 17 last year, I think Allen was the number one fantasy player out of everyone.
Yeah.
Out of everyone.
Out of everyone. And I can speak from experience to that because it was literally like having 3 players. His value was so huge that it was like starting 3 players at one position because he could run for a touchdown, he could throw for a touchdown, he could throw for yards, and he could run for yards. So it was like having four ways to get points in one. And I think he's going to be better. I've talked about it a lot on the podcast, obviously, but when we go back to how we started the podcast, you said something that kind of confirmed why I think Josh Allen is a quarterback sleeper for fantasy, and it's because the team around him is better than what it was last year. And he did those numbers in fantasy with that bad of a team. So it's going to be very fun. And Josh, before we wrap things up, I'm very pumped that you're going to be playing in the fantasy league this year for the podcast. And each and every week, I'm going to have somebody on the podcast from within the league, talking about their team and everything. I'm gonna be doing a post draft show as well to talk about your team and some of the thoughts that went through your mind while you were waiting patiently to get to take who you want to take, and then to see him maybe get picked, or maybe end up with the players that you really, really wanted, and that does happen too. But very happy to have you in the league, and for all those that are listening, what is your Twitter? Give them your info. Let the people know how they can follow you.
All right, yeah. So you can follow me at Josh Wrest, JOSHWREST. The name J Dub's on there. I am just bumping out content now, and I'm actually going to be doing fantasy videos throughout the season. And the main concept of what I'm going to be doing is I want people involved. Because I do see myself as like a high-end fantasy player, but even besides the point is talking about it. You know what I mean? Like, even today, to be honest, you've given me some ideas myself. That's the fun about it, though. I'm going to be talking, I want to take a running back first round, second round, where you could come at me, and again, you could be rude about it, I don't care, but you could come at me like, why would you do that? I'm going to go receiver, running back. I'd say, sure, why? Talk to me, like, I want to hear it, and not only that, if people are commenting, converse with each other. I love to talk. Everyone loves to talk fantasy. Do it. Let's get people going. Let's just get everyone involved. I agree. One rule, I want involvement from everyone.
Right. I couldn't agree more. And how long have, as we wrap it up here, how long have you been, working with the Trainwreck Sports guys? Degenerate Al, Maniac, Zach Sheldon and Alex Shoup and Ty B.
Yeah, so number one, for y'all that don't know me, we're just trying to give you some of my info. I work for Trainwreck Sports, and I've been doing work for them for about 7-8 months. Absolute fantastic guys. They pretty much just brought me in and adopted me at this point. So I actually messaged them back in, I think it was like December, January. I started doing video work for them. Now, we're making big strides. We got multiple platforms. Multiple shows. I'm on a betting show, Degenerate Danger Zone. You can find me on there as well. That's in my profile. That's fun. We shoot it back and forth. Again, we're not high-end bettors, but we're having fun with it, and we like to hear everyone's bet. So that's another thing we want to hear you involved. But yeah, so it's been about 7 months. We do events all around Buffalo. Thomas Take's been on the show. He loves it.
Yeah, I did.
we love having you on too, buddy.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
We're always out, so we want people to come out. And I know you're pretty much always there too, so you can see all of us.
Yeah. It's been a real blessing. Not to sound corny or anything like that, but when I went to the first Buffalo Podathon that was for the BB&G charities, I went there, lone wolf, because this show, I'm a one-man wrecking crew, as I like to say, and I didn't know anybody, and I met those guys on, right at that event, and they said, hey, you're coming on with us, this is the set list, you're coming on with us, and to go on a show with guys that you don't even know, and to feel like you've known them since you were in, middle school or grade school, it was pretty cool, and it goes without saying, but they're just great guys, and in this business, in this, racket or entity, it's good to have more guys like them, right?
Oh, absolutely. Like you just said, you felt like you knew him from high school. It's been 7 months. Again, I felt like I've been doing this for my whole life.
That's awesome.
You kind of sit back and you're like, holy crap, it's been only 7 months. But yeah, it's just a blast, and we try to make it fun for everyone, especially with Bills season come up. We're going to be doing UB tailgates and Bills tailgates. We have our own parties there, so you come out and you hang with us if you want.
For sure. I'll be there.
Oh yeah, but that's the thing. We want to have fun. We want to have fun with everyone. It's not about being better than anyone. It's about having fun with everyone and talking and conversing and getting input from everyone.
Right. Well, Josh, I greatly appreciate you coming on. It's been a true pleasure having you on. And everybody give Josh a follow on Twitter, at Josh Wrest. And I cannot wait for this Fantasy League, man. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, you're telling me I'm super excited, and thanks for having me on. It was a blast. I think we could have done this for another 6 more hours.